socio-economic, socio-political and legal status of land ownership, land control and remedies available is of pivotal importance. Now, post-conflict Sri Lanka saw a large number of land issues, especially in the north and east of the country. A lack of documentation pertaining to lands, illegal and arbitrary land acquisitions, evictions, these are only a handful of the land-related issues that have surfaced in Sri Lanka. Tonight's focus will be on land rights, legal rights over land rights, and the current Sri Lankan landscape, in light of several recent cabinet decisions which we'll be discussing. I'm pleased to welcome back to the studio Attorney at Law Migara Dos. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Sonali.
Migara, as a precursor to this conversation, if we could set the stage and draw attention to some of the key concerns and problems faced by Sri Lankans with respect to policies implemented over the years and recently over state land.
I think basically, Sonali, a lot of people in this country, especially in rural areas, they occupy lands which were granted to them by the state, either by way of a grant or a permit under the Land Development Ordinance. So there are challenges about their land ownership, certain measures taken up by the governments to change or introduce various changes for this ownership of the people. And also, as you spoke very correctly about the north and east, there's a huge issue of landlessness because the people who are returning back to their hometowns and their homes need to get legal recognition or legal rights to occupy and possess those lands. And also there's another issue concerning plantation workers. They're also occupying land. So there needs to be some form of recognition given to them and also to address the immediate grievances concerning land. Now, in light of all these, very recently there are several policy decisions adopted by the government which affect the land rights of the people with regards to state land. So I think these will carry huge repercussions for the future. So therefore, I think it's important that we create a public debate and also public awareness about these recent policy decisions adopted by the government.
Migara, recently a statement was issued by the People's Alliance for Right to Land on two cabinet decisions made on the 12th of February and 4th of March 2024 with regard to lands owned by the state and state statutory institutions, the proposed amendment to the Forest Conservation Ordinance and the Urumaya program. Let's go through the salient points of each of these. Speak to us about the implications of these two cabinet decisions first.
Right, Sonali, about the cabinet decisions, there have been two cabinet decisions adopted by the present government, one on the 12th of February and the other on the 4th of March. The first one of these, where it proposes that there are certain lands held by the Janata Estate Development Board and the State Plantation Corporation. So the proposal by the cabinet is to open up these lands for private investors. Now these are lands held by government institutions and the proposal is to introduce them up to the private market. Second cabinet decision pertains to the establishment of a land management trust specifically handled by the Secretary to the President. Now this cabinet decision proposes to also alienate lands held by government departments to the private sector. Now the immediate problem concerning these are, now initially departments and institutions like the State Plantation Corporation or the Janata Estate Development Board were created with the specific objective of managing lands owned by the state and also to nurture the lives and livelihoods of the plantation communities and neighboring people who are occupying those lands. So basically that is an objective of those state institutions vested upon them by the state. Now over the years, what this cabinet proposal says is, over the years, they have failed in achieving this objective. Now what they are proposing is to sell this land out to private parties. Now the question is, okay, if these institutions have failed, what should be their next course of action? Is it to remedy those errors in those state institutions or to privatize land? Now the issue with privatizing land is not a property of any government. It is a heritage of the people. So our previous generation benefited from these lands, they cultivated them, they nurtured those lands and those lands nurtured back their lives. So I think it's the responsibility of the government to ensure that the present generation and also the future generations are entitled to benefit from these lands and they cannot give away them. Now, for example, in the Supreme Court in the Pavala phosphate case, clearly outlined that land is a resource owned by the community. So you cannot deprive the community and our people of that heritage. So I think that is a huge issue that a government cannot make with basically a pen. So I think this is a serious issue which might carry serious consequences on the people for the future.
If we are to play devil's advocate, what are the positives of this proposed decision?
I think, Sonali, the only positive that they try to point out is like when you open it up to the private market, it will create like export-oriented cultivations and export-oriented livestock breeding and all that. So basically, it's the theory is that when you open them up to the private market, there's a possibility of earning more dollars and more profit through that as opposed to the system of the state managing it. But when you consider this argument, Sonali, this is not something new. We've heard of this argument from 1977 onwards, where the government in power then proposed that opening up land, state lands for the private sector would bring us huge profits. But over time, over 40 years since then, when we look back, we get to realize that this is not true. For example, most of the investments that were made on state land back then for crops such as mango or sugarcane or tea and tobacco, they didn't reap the profits as they were as was promised. And also we saw like many private investors, when they took over land, they used environmentally hazardous farming methods, where after a while, in search of immediate profits, they destroyed the lands and basically those lands became fertile. And also when you see some of the methods carried out by private investors or private sector on land, the water resource was depleted and people suffered from that. And also the water was polluted in some cases, whereas in many rural areas, chronic kidney disease plagued those communities. So I think when you look at that, the promise of private investments bringing profits had not been true for the past 40 years. And this is not something limited to Sri Lanka alone. When you look at most African countries, Latin American countries and Asian countries also, this experiment has clearly failed. So basically, despite we being promised of greater fortunes from opening up our lands to the private sector, it's very clear that for the past 40 years this has not been true. So we cannot have much optimism on that anymore.
The statement by the People's Alliance for Right to Land, and I'd like to read an excerpt because I think it's important to bring in the context, the nuance. They speak about the immense destruction that the people and the environment of the country have had to face in the long term, resulting from such businesses have been far more serious. Most of the investors adopted farming methods that completely destroyed the fertility of the soil within a short period of time by applying large quantities of external inputs, and have now given up on those lands by leaving barren lands after reaping maximum profits from those lands. Groundwater resources in these areas have been severely depleted. People living in these areas have had to face a number of long-term diseases, including chronic kidney disease due to unsustainable, adverse environmental practice. There have been long-term irreversible impacts on the ecosystems because of the massive destructions that have been caused to the environment through these plantations. Now, Migara, these surely are monitored. There are environmental laws that protect and uphold the sanctity of the environment.
Certainly there are, and there's also authorities and state institutions established for the purpose of preserving the environment for us and for our future generations also.
Yeah.
But despite all that being there, and the lands of the state belonging or rather occupied by the people, those rights have been violated all these years. But now we propose to open up those lands even further towards the private sector, so as to loosen all regulations that existed before that. So I think this would create a very dangerous precedent, where the bad experiences we have experienced all this time, the experiences in the future would be far worse. So I think the whole argument or the logic of private investments bringing fruits for our future, I think has failed. And when you look at it, as you very correctly said, some of the farming methods that the companies have been using have given us very dire consequences, like a chronic kidney disease for entire communities. Their groundwater resources completely being depleted. So that is the horrendous experience we've had. So I don't think there's any further reason for us to believe in more of these arguments. And I think we need to protect the resource of land for our future, because landlessness, once you sell out these lands, it creates an issue of landlessness in the country. And landlessness is a very serious social consequence where people are affected extremely hard by an issue of landlessness. For example, in 1848, the rebellion, if you take the rebellion in 1848, the main reason was landlessness. And also in the North and East, in the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation report, outlines landlessness as one issue that contributed to the ethnic conflict also. So we are creating a situation where we are selling off the people's lands to private parties, but we don't consider the consequences it will have on our own people. It could be very dangerous.
We are in conversation with Attorney at Law Migara Dos. We're going for a break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
Shakti Crowd.
Shakti Crowd.
Every Saturday and Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Tune in to Shakti TV.
Because this impacts every single person living in the country.
All these jokers who completely vehemently opposed it, right? And now saying, no, we are okay with them. We have to work with them. We will work with them.
All the people who have supported him for these corrupt practices have been taken in.
Because sadly, our people in this country now think that this is a protest vote, that all the major two parties have failed, and let's give a third party another chance.
Why can't a government officer be entrepreneur as well?
I believe most of political parties don't have internal democracy.
පූජා කියන්නේ ලේසියෙන් දල කඩන්න පුළුවන් හැපින්නක් නෙමෙයි.
තල කඩලත් නවත්තන්න බැරි නම්
මට ලොකු සැකයක් තියෙනවා. මේ හැම දෙයක් පිටිපස්සෙම ඉන්නේ පූජා කියලා. එයා බොරුවට අහිංසක විදිහට ආයිසා රඟපානවා.
මේ පූජාව අල්ලන්න හිතාගෙන කුරුළු මෙහෙම දෙයක් කරා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. කුරුළු නම් අභිමන්ගේ කඩේට ගෙන තිබ්බේ. කුරුළු මමවට කවදාවත් සමාවක් දෙන්නේ නැහැ.
කුරුළු අභිමන්ට ආදරේ ඇති මංක නැහැ කියලා කියන්නේ නැහැ. හැබැයි මට තියෙන ප්‍රශ්නේ ආදරේ කියලා ඔය වගේ පරිගන්න පුළුවන්ද මිනිස්සු?
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Sinharaja, Sri Lanka's precious world heritage.
TV1, TV for life.
Sri Lanka sets records in women's cricket.
Bachamari Atapatu, she ends.
Iran rescues 21 Sri Lankan crewmen from sinking tanker in Gulf of Oman. Sri Lankan youth freed from cybercrime ensnarement in Myanmar return home. Sri Lanka poised for bondholder deal by mid-May. Court extends enjoining order against Maithripala Sirisena. Nalin Bandara hints about a window for the general election ahead of the presidential poll. Janaka Ratnayaka goes to the Magistrates Court seeking relief via the Online Safety Act.
TV1. TV for life. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. Our topic of discussion tonight is land rights, legal rights over land rights, and the current Sri Lankan landscape. My guest tonight is Attorney at Law Migara Dos. Migara, the government is in the process of implementing something that's called the Urumaya program, under which individuals who were permit or grant holders will now be granted freehold transferable deeds. Speak to us about the implications of the implementation of this program.
Now, as of the last few months, the government have been implementing this Urumaya program, especially targeting those people who have been holding property under grants and permits under the Land Development Ordinance. Now, these permits and grants pertain to basically agricultural lands.
Sure.
And once they occupy those lands, they do not have a unconditional right of alienating them. There are certain conditions that need to be made or met by the people when you alienate those lands. For instance, you need to have an alternate land to alienate the land under permit, or sufficient means of income, and also you need to transfer it to a person who would carry on agricultural activities on those lands.
Right.
And also it is mandatory to obtain the consent from the divisional secretary to transfer a land under a grant or a permit.
Okay.
And also once you occupy those lands, there are certain laws like the Agrarian Development Act, where you are compelled to engage in agricultural cultivation on those lands. So that is to safeguard and promote the agricultural nature or the agrarian culture in our country. Now, under this system of grants and permits, there are no ways, or rather there are so many obstacles to transfer these lands to private parties or basically private investors. Now, what is being done in the guise of this Urumaya program is you are trying to remove all those obstacles of transferring those lands to private parties. Now, when you give freehold deeds to the people, they are free to transfer those lands to any party whom they wish. Now, as I said before, now these lands are agricultural lands. What is the plight of agriculture in this country as of now? Basically, the state has given up on its responsibility in aiding and sponsoring the ordinary farmer. Their fertilizer subsidies have not been properly given, the farmers' insurance have not been properly given, and as a result of those ill-conceived policies, right now, the ordinary farmer is burdened with so much debt. And it is that debt-stricken farmer who is given a freehold deed under the Urumaya program. So what happens next? It's very obvious. The ordinary farmer who is given a freehold deed would definitely transfer those deeds to private parties. So in the guise of giving people deed with freehold transferable rights, the government is basically paving the way for state lands which were occupied by the people for the benefit of the agrarian culture in this country to completely transfer them to private parties. Now, for example, during the COVID-19 period, many of the urban workforce had lost their jobs and had to go back to their villages. So basically they had a livelihood in their village because they had land, they had family land under grants and permits. So basically when you take that away, that heritage of the people, that identity of the people, that culture of the people, of an agrarian culture would completely be lost. So I think the Urumaya program, in guise of trying to empower the people, are trying to deprive them of their only right, which is a right for land.
Are you saying that if a debt-stricken farmer who thus far had so many obstacles to selling or alienating his land which he got through a permit or grant, now can just go crazy with it and sell it off?
What I'm saying is right now the ordinary farmer is so burdened with so much debt. Agriculture, farming is not a lucrative vocation anymore. Basically, with the fertilizer subsidy being cut off and without any sponsorship or aid from the government, the farmers have been debt-stricken for so many years. As we know, that is why people do not engage in farming anymore. So basically the farmer who has been given this freehold right would have to pay off his debts eventually. He'll have to sustain himself first. And for that he doesn't have the support, he doesn't have the sponsorship from the governments in power. So basically, therefore, the natural consequence would be the farmer would be compelled to transfer their lands. I'm not saying every farmer who gets a freehold deed will do that, but there's a huge possibility of that happening, and this is paving the way to transfer state-owned lands for the private sector, which you cannot do under grants or permits issued by the Land Development Ordinance.
Do you see a direct link between this or the repercussions of this program and homelessness?
Basically, landlessness, I think, is the more serious issue because the people in our country, their home, their land was part of their culture. So when you deprive them of that vocation, deprive them of their heritage, I think basically there'll be people without a purpose. So I think that's going to have a huge impact on the rural culture of Sri Lanka and also the nation at large.
Sure. So Migara, now that the program is being implemented at present, surely the experts can come up with ways in which they could reduce the burdens on the farmers, maybe equip them with knowledge, give them more options. How do you see that paradigm?
I think initially you're right. Basically, as we said, the problem in the agricultural sector is the farmer is unable to sustain himself and his vocation in farming. So basically the state needs to step in and without rather than giving the farmer a freehold transferable deed, what he should give him is subsidized fertilizer, should give him subsidies with regard to farming, should enhance the farmer's insurance in case of his crops are lost. So basically you need to sustain the farmer who was at one time the bedrock of our economy and ensure that they can lift their heads high and do their job properly, or rather engage in their vocation properly. And also I think it's important to ensure that these agricultural lands are preserved. That's why there had been laws for all these years. For example, you cannot transfer it at your whims and fancies. Even if you're transferring it, it should be for the purpose of agrarian cultivation. So there is a logic behind that law. And also the Agrarian Development Act, there are provisions to ensure that the agricultural cultivation of those lands continue without any interruption. So I think maintaining that culture is also important, whilst, or rather it's even more important to ensure that the farmer is provided necessary subsidies under government intervention to properly sustain himself.
All right. Migara, we also need to talk about the proposed amendment to the Forest Conservation Ordinance.
Recently, there are certain rumours flying that the government intends to introduce an amendment to the Forest Ordinance. Now, the Forest Ordinance under Section 20 of that ordinance, now there are certain categories of forests as conservation forest, reserve forest and village forest. There are forests not belonging to all those three categories, which are called other state-owned forests.
Okay.
Now, Section 20 provides for certain safeguards with regard to these other state-owned forests, wherein human activity and human development are proscribed on those forests for the sake of preserving the ecology or the ecosystems of those respective forests.
Sure.
Now, that is the law at present. Now, there is a proposal to introduce an amendment to Section 20 and introduce a new category called multiple use management forests. So these other state-owned forests are going to be converted as multiple use management forests, wherein you can engage in ecotourism and renewable energy activities in those forest areas. Now the big issue concerning this amendment is, now there is a protection for them under Section 20 for this type of forest. That is because they have their unique ecosystems which are connected to reserve forests. Now, when you destroy that ecosystem, it will have an impact on the reserve forest as well. So that is why the legislature in its wisdom had created a system where these forests can also be protected. But what would happen when you allow development activities to take place in these forests is, this unique ecosystem would be completely destroyed. And also it is important to note that these other state forests are a natural habitat for endangered species. Now they will go extinct if you engage in development activity without any restraint. And also it is important to note that these forests also have water catchments for lakes and reservoirs. So once those are affected again, there will be huge impacts on the people. Then I think the most important factor is these state forests are also habitats and corridors for elephants. They provide elephant corridors. And as of now, the reason for the human-elephant conflict is some of these forests have been illegally encroached by people. But when you legalize that encroachment, we can imagine how worse the situation will be. I think your channel also some time back gave wide coverage for protest in Valsapugala farmers, where they were affected by the elephant crisis. I think that was because people had encroached into those areas whilst they were protected by law. But now we are creating a system where tourism is openly allowed in those forest areas. So when that affects the elephant corridors, when that affects the natural habitat of animals, this conflict will certainly be worsened. And also with regard to environment, we need not, it's very obvious the consequences that we will face.
So what needs to be done now?
Basically this amendment needs to be defeated, and basically I think there needs to be more awareness amongst the public as to why there is a need to implement or rather open up these forests for development activities. There's a reason that they were protected. There was a reason why human activity was not permitted in them. So why now? Why now, and what is the result it would create? It's obvious. Basically it's a habitat for endangered species. It will worsen the human-elephant conflict, and also the unique ecology of those forests would be completely destroyed. So I think we need to understand the repercussions of these policies that have been introduced. And this amendment, I think the public needs to fight against it and basically say no for amendments of this nature.
Politicization of land, we can't really escape that, can we, Migara? My final question to you is, what is the future of land governance and management in the context of us knowing that we are only a part of this larger ecosystem which we are bound to protect, as is the state?
I think, Sonali, in 1972, under the land reform law, the state took over so many areas and extents of land for to be governed under the land reform law. So when the state takes over that land, it has a responsibility of preserving, protecting and nurturing that land. So after several decades, we cannot now say, no, look here, we cannot do this anymore, we want to open up for the private investors again, because that has had horrendous consequences to us. So the state is the guardian of the people and its resources and its land. So the state needs to step into that responsibility and protect that land resource for our generation as well as for the future. And if they're evading that responsibility, I think that's a very, very serious concern for the people. And as you said about politicization of land, the state was vested with the responsibility of protecting the land resource. Instead, what happened was they were basically polluting it. They were abusing that power, and so many lands vested in the state were given away for private parties, mostly illegally. I think that had created a huge issue amongst the rural areas where people, their resource was just given away for certain companies for business purposes and all that. So I think we've had horrendous experiences with maladministration. So I think the state needs to understand its responsibility, its noble responsibility with regard to state land, and step in and protect it for us as well as for our future. If they're not doing it, I think the people have a responsibility of bringing them to their senses.
All right, very well put. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives and for elucidating this issue quite clearly. Thank you very much, Migara.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.